Chuck Schuldiner's birthday on May 13th proved a perfect time to bring our channel partner Joe into the mix. At long last, a guitar is dead. That was Joe in the introductory clip you saw from December 2010 when a bunch of his nearest and dearest friends, we think, invited ourselves out to his studio in Colorado, San Luis Sound. Joe spent some time growing up with Mr. Schuldiner, north of Orlando in the suburb of Altamont Springs, and he talks about the music scene at that time. I grew up in a suburb north of there, so it was really out of that scene. But we found an article on Louder Sound in which Rick Rozz remembered meeting Chuck at a backyard party in Central Florida, and he and Cam Lee had the band Mantis, and things went on from there. So Joe talks about spending time with Chuck, what it was like as a kid, and we talk more about that Orlando music scene, which was quite fertile, but you mostly hear about the punk scene there in the late 80s, early 90s, and then some of the post-grunge that was going on there, I guess, in the mid-90s. But there was a really fertile metal scene going on there, and it wasn't just the hair stuff, it was obviously something radically different. So I hope you enjoy this interview. I know it's another Guitar Bro channel on the YouTubes here, but we hope you enjoy it, and we hope to have many more conversations like this.
Yesterday was Chuck Schuldiner's birthday, and I remembered that you kind of grown up in the same neighborhood as him, right?
I did.
Yeah.
I have a collection of scattered but fond memories of he and I, probably early teens through middle teens, and then kind of keeping in touch here and there as we both kind of went down our musical paths. His obviously blew up for good reason and became pretty incredible, and kind of lost track of him at that point, but always paying attention and following along. But yeah, my first memories are just us on BMX bikes.
Nice.
Riding around. But he was a really good guy, and it just was interesting. At times I was jealous, to follow his career and see his ascension rightly to the places he went.
So were you guys, because I don't know if you want to mention the band you had started, or you were with the Pink Stacks and all, you had nothing to do with that, right?
Yeah, that was Snatch. And I probably knew Chuck in and out of that time period, but I can't say that we had any interactions from a band standpoint, like our bands playing together. And I guess we'll jump to this more later about the weird incubator that north of Orlando somehow became. And it was built through a network of storage units. Ultimately, there's running in tandem were storage units and milk crates. And that was the genesis for so many bands back then. So we would interact on the level that we pop in other people's storage bay areas and hang out, watch their band rehearse, watch somebody practice by themselves, talk shit about each other, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But, that was it. That was the early seeds of seeing him do his thing. And it was good. Prior to that, again, he and I were just a couple of kids in the neighborhood that would get on our BMX bikes, and we'd ride to the Catholic girls' school and hang out back, because that's where some of the Catholic girls hung out.
Yeah.
And we'd go to the mall, and have fun like that. Just all the neighborhood kids, doing our things, and slowly developing our quasi young adult personalities. And we weren't super close, but we hung out, and I have, again, fond memories of him just being a gentle person and us having some good talks here and there. But it was great to see. We were skeptical at first. You're doing what? When they got signed to Combat Records for that first album, we would get this info back through the grapevine of friends of, what are they doing? How's it happening? And there was this one before the album came out, but we knew it was done recording. This one story came through that they got paid $800 in a bag of weed. And I never know if that was validated or not by anybody, but it was stuff like that. What's going on with Chuck? What's going on with the band? So that was kind of the early parts of that. And it was fun. It was fun to be a party to all that. There was a network of us, players at different levels, playing different styles. And what I did like, and I still think about, was there was enough of us doing different things, but we still hung together. we were a loose brotherhood. And so the guys that were into jazz and blues rock and reggae, and, Chuck was, of course, making something wholly different and new, to say the least. But, we're all there talking about it, being a part of it. So again, good.
It's weird because I was talking to my guitar teacher about that, and he was talking about, well, he came down. I didn't know he'd come down right around in 1980, the early 80s. They said a ton of great musicians. I mean, Disney bands were coming up, and Downtown Jazz and Blues, or whatever it was called, or it was the Blue Note and became Downtown Jazz. And the Genitorturers were there. I don't know if they were there right then, but I mean, Jen was out there. It's just like, it was weird because you had like those early bands, Craven A, Naomi's Hair, Braille Closet, right? And Spring Iguanas of Love. You had that group of people, and it's like, it felt like, I mean, I'm totally ignorant. I was just like not hanging around with you guys. I was way out in Sanford. Nobody cared, right? So, yeah. I mean, which is like 10 miles away. It's like, but Altamont was like, ooh, it's like but it's interesting. I mean, he came from Long Island. Was there, I don't remember there being like, there was a metal community, but was he kind of reacting to that, or was that just completely in his head?
That's a good question. I think there was a hybrid approach for him, because he seemed like he was very thought out, and the evolution of his music over the years with his other projects, you see that, he went more melodic manner, more, like rhythmically challenging, things like that. So I think he was, I mean, you're up to the point you're at to when you're at that point, but he was always pursuing something different and new. And I think going as far as he could and pushing it. But at the same time, there was a pretty interesting underground scene of really heavy players. I mean, of course, there was one drummer, 3 bass players, and 72 guitar players, but lots of heavy riffs, lots of heavy stuff. And I recall every once in a while, we'd end up at one of the rehearsal spaces, which was usually a warehouse, a storage unit of some sort. Sometimes somebody's uncle had a print shop, or some sort of light manufacturing, and they let people jam there. And it was every once in a while, there'd be these older guys that were straight up bikers. I mean, leather cuts, but they'd be playing. And they were definitely doing, for lack of a better term, kind of this, old, early dark metal, blues infused riffs. And they would drone on these things. Borderline stoner rock before that was really a genre, I guess. But I have a feeling that to some degree they had some influences, not necessarily on Chuck, but on that scene at the time. Because these guys would pop in and out, and they were clearly older than all of us by a decade plus. They just show up and jam for a little bit, smoke some weed and hang out and have some commentary here and there. But it was, we weren't necessarily in awe of their playing, but I would remember that we'd all say, what was he doing? That was a cool riff, So I don't know, there might have been a little bit of that zeitgeist at the time, but to answer your question, Chuck was definitely, I think, pushing his own envelopes, and trying to at least reinvent the wheel, he had his idea of where he wanted what he was doing to go to. So, and I felt like he was very successful in the beginning. I mean, all the way through, but I mean, to get in to do that right away, to more or less have a home run in your own genre right off the bat, that's pretty impressive.
Well, it's good if you invent your genre. A room of one.
That my next, funny memory of that is when the first album came out, and then actually, I think it was a Leprosy, the second one. I would tease him. We were like, give him a hard time about his voice, and he was a good sport about it, but we'd sing along, like, it was all good fun. We were, a loose band of brothers. And one day I went over to my buddy Ralph's house, and Ralph said, Chuck called me earlier today and he told me to come over, and you're not going to believe this. And, of course, this is pre-internet, right?
Right.
Ralph gets called over to the Chucks. Ralph and I being people that used to tease Chuck about his voice.
Yeah.
And he's got duffel bags full of fan mail from around the country and Europe.
Nice.
And they're just going through them, having fun looking at them.
Wow.
And I think Combat Records had forwarded all this stuff to him. I could be wrong, and Ralph said to me, "We can't make fun of Chuck anymore." And I said, "No, we definitely can't."
That's right.
So, and again, he was a good sport about it. But
Sure.
yeah, it was just an interesting, lucky little point in time, this little petri dish of different players spending time together. And I joke about the 72 guitar players, but we'd go to jam and there'd be 12 of us and we just all take turns, and 2 or 3 of us would play at a time, often poorly, sometimes well, but you'd pay attention, you'd listen, you'd pick up from each other little things. And so I think that was part of that, that recipe for starting to get somewhere, and him, again, I think Chuck was very much his own man and had a pretty clear vision of what he wanted to do, because that really did come out of left field. I felt at the time, I just thought for all the heavy stuff I was enjoying at the time, nobody was really doing anything like that at all.
Was he one of the, it's like, so you met him in the neighborhood, not necessarily even at school. It was just like in the subdivision, right?
Yeah.
Why, you broke up there? What was it?
Just kids on bikes.
Bikes, yeah, okay. That's
Not even in school. I don't remember them from school. So, and I don't even know if we went to the same school. We could have, as was the case with so many musicians, all of us with long hair. I mean, we were loners, so who knows? We could have stayed in our own corners, but we just met in the hood, riding our bikes around, going to the mall, stealing milk cartons or milk crates rather.
Yeah.
That was a store of wealth back then, was a milk crate. And I do remember another great memory was they were playing some small informal outside event. And back then we would get milk crates and stack them upside down because they'd interlock, and then we'd get a couple sheets of plywood, couple 4x8 sheets, and make a stage either for the band or the drummer. And all the milk crates back then were stamped with like the fine, the legal penalty for possessing in the dollar fine if caught with it in progress. And we used to joke because we would steal them, collect them anywhere we could, and we'd build a stage. And we'd say, get $800 worth of, milk crate for the stage. We were so proud of ourselves. But I remember he and I and a couple other guys tooling around, getting as many milk crates as we could, and then stacking them up. And then they played this kind of informal gig outside somewhere. It was just a lot of fun. And of course, to go back now and to have a recording of it or some footage would be great. But it was just those, brilliant little moments where kids are being kids, at that point, not really kids, but still in a way, but it was just what we did. We weren't into sports, we weren't, I don't know, that was it. Once we all discovered a guitar, it was down that rabbit hole, and people played and played and played and played. And so
it's interesting because I when I think of the metal scene back in Orlando, I remember the FBI, and just I should do real quick context. So you got Orlando, right? Altamont Springs, and the subdivision we're talking about where Joe and Chuck lived, is about 10 miles north of downtown, 810, right up I-4. And then I was another 6 to 8 miles away north on the way to Daytona Beach. I-4 goes from Tampa. I should go the other way, from the southwest Tampa all the way to northeast to Daytona, and all these towns are just right on that line.
Right.
Winter Park is a couple miles away from Altamont, maybe 5 minutes. I just remember the FBI was like a metal haven, but Fairbanks Inn, but it was like lower key. I never even got there. It was like the hair band stuff and bands that were like, had been roots, now they're hair bands. And the other thing I remember I heard is that they were doing shows down in Tampa, like these closed door shows and whatnot. But there was some kind of thing going on, but it's like, obviously it's like LA-ish. It's so remote. You don't have mass transit. You're kind of stuck in your little neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah, very much the case. And I'm sure they probably broke out, and because down in Tampa and Ybor City, people were having like warehouse shows, and there was a devout, like heavy metal scene down there, death metal subsequently, a lot of grindcore. So that was, boy, Tampa and Ybor City, that area was always they were showing up to support those sorts of shows. I think Orlando proper, there was like the FBI had that kind of more hair band, rock, more radio friendly sort of stuff. And then in Orlando, we had that mix again. It was very eclectic. Everybody was kind of just hanging a shingle out, and every shingle was every shape and color there could be. And that was fine. It was fun because we'd be on bills with a country band and a hip hop band, all original. And that was great. I mean, it was just people doing their thing.
And that's in the 80s.
Yeah.
80s, early 90s.
Late 80s, yeah. And then into the early 90s, some of the same. I think Death, they, again, my memories of it are fuzzy. Yeah. There was just the little outside gigs and garage gigs. That was the stuff I was kind of a party to or privy to in their early days. And then they just kind of disappeared. And I don't mean they like fell off the map. I think they, they were traveling. Like, again, we'd get the word back. Oh, they're making Leprosy. They're making the next record. And what's the scuttlebutt? What's going on? Yeah. But they had already grown up and moved on. And I mean that in a good way. So we were still in a microcosm of our scene and, torn around the state, but they had gone on to bigger things already. So from there, it was like, I'd catch them on, music news, I'd hear the recordings. So it was, I think they had to spread their wings to, again, a part of, his vision was, let's get up and go. And I know there were some problems like the first European tour, and then which I guess went really poorly. And then the second one that got canceled almost right before it because of the concerns of the first one. I may be getting some of these facts out of line, but, so they were almost suffering some of those vagaries of being a young band that's blowing up fast, in a market that doesn't know how to handle you,
That's the thing. Yeah. That's what we were talking. Yeah, I was talking about in the Randy Rhoads video. It's like nobody knew. I mean, thrash had kind of mainstream by then. I remember I was telling this on the Metalheads podcast that the first time I ever heard Metallica were these two guys, and Jeff had actually played. Joe was in a band called Black Hats and Bottle Rockets, one of Orlando's best, with Jeff Zankowski, who I used to be in a band with. My claim to fame is that whoever I'm in a band with goes on to better bands. That's my musical legacy. So that's hook up with me and you'll be set afterward.
You're a gateway member.
More like a rubber bouncing off rubber glue thing. But I remember these two guys playing like the early Metallica in some garage, like beautiful leafy green palm tree suburban, Orlando, bright skies. Like, why is everyone inside? But there are just those folks. I mean, it's kind of like the opposite of the Seattle scene where it's so rainy. You go in down there, it's so fucking hot. You can't, I don't want to. I don't, if you're a beach guy or a fisher, that's fine. But, the rest of it's just like, it's too hot, man. Crank up the AC and play, so there was, I remember also, the big bands after that first wave of indie was kind of Damage, right? And Love Gods, and they started Club Space Fish and the Space Fish label, and they were doing the sort of the CMJ, right? I think we're up in New York.
Yeah.
Well, but it's like that incredibly divergent world where they're right next to each other, and no one's, I wonder if that's possible today. I mean, they talk about the internet scene, how grunge in Seattle was the last pre-internet scene. Now you've all got to be on internet. I wonder if it's possible to still create that scene and connect with people, because the word of mouth, if they love you, like, they love Death, is kind of going to come up anyway.
Yeah.
Can you maintain that mystery, I guess?
I agree with you. I think that there are, outlier communities where kids, I use that term in the weird way, kids, kids are doing their thing because it's keeping them alive, and they're playing. That's what I mean. They're playing. down here in South Central Colorado, we're kind of out there a little ways in Salida. You get further south of here and you run into some really big open areas where towns are few and far between. And interestingly enough, I have run in, and that bleeds into New Mexico, northern New Mexico. And over the years, I've run into small little bands here and there, small little networks of people playing together that are very community based. Young kids, younger kids, a lot of punk stuff, really good, really fun. And it's almost like they know the outside world is there, but they don't have time for it. And because their aspirations are kind of immediate and interpersonal, they're not bothering to like spend a lot of time online pushing their, you know, their stuff, and for better or for worse. So I run into that here and there. I find older people that play, you know, now mid 50s, I bump into a lot of other 50-year-olds that grew up listening to all the same stuff we did. And they, you know, they get together and jam on the weekends and do their thing. And some of them are really fantastic. It's almost like by virtue of the fact that these entities that I'm talking about, an example, are not going out of their way to be known. They don't fall into that data model that says this is what's out there and, you know, this is what we know about it and how you get to it. Here's the conduit and the contact points. I think there are artists, there are bands out there just doing it for themselves.
Yeah.
So it happens. The whole scene thing that we grew up with, and when we reference Seattle, obviously many others, that was a different time and a place, and through a different mechanism, by which I remember making flyers for every show in Orlando. Again, we had no internet. We had telephone poles and a staple. And I loved it. It was a function of what we did. We'd all sit around making flyers, hand making them, copying them, you know, and then we'd go out and put them up. And that was a part of that feeling, that vibe, that community. And don't get me wrong, all the opportunities artists have now, I think, are fantastic. It's just like a different line of travel. Some people blow up, some people put the cart before the horse, you know. So can it happen again? I think it does. I just think now it's really a bigger divide. There are these little enclaves of bands and people making music that just do it for the smallest group of folks and friends. And then people that are just, you know, shooting the moon, using every opportunity online, you know. So.
It's kind of like, it's a little different. I mean, touring bands that hit these odd places. I mean, you lived up in Netherlands, way up, like what, 8,000 feet high, something like that.
Up Boulder. Yeah.
And I remember that place you brought us to where Critters Buggin' had played and some other folks and stuff. It's like, I mean, that's out there. It's like, you've got to know, or they've got to know. I mean, who's booking that kind of a thing? And it's,
right.
You know, it's, I mean, again, now you've got, you know, I don't know. I wonder if it's just, would it have been any different? I mean, the moment in time that is the technology of how you communicate versus, you know, you had Sabbath, you had Ozzy and Randy Rhoads, and now you've got, you know, all the thrash stuff coming out. Is that more just a function of, you know, the evolution of the music, and it would have come about, you know, and future evolution will come about regardless of the internet anyway. It's, you know, so that's just some kid on his bike.
Yeah, I would certainly like to think so.
Yeah.
And there's the two-sided sword, you know, in that people are mining the past. And they're, you know, I mean, if you look at fashion, you know, I was a child of the 70s. And so when it's a single strap, you know, bikini top, I'm like, wait, they did that already. Can't you do something else? You know, and so there's that where I think certain levels of production, producers, what's left of A&R people, what's left of bands that they're digging for things. So there's that, and there's mixed blessing to that. And then there are people that are they're just doing their thing. Yeah. You know, it's somewhat dependent upon skill set, and I think that's great. That's one of the numerous things I love about guitar is you could write great music with 2 strings. You know, you could write great melodies on a guitar with 1 string in a fuzz box, and you could be a virtuoso, you know, and do wonderful stuff as well. I don't think the 2 are mutually exclusive. I feel like with guitar, and that's an important thing to consider when we have this whole bigger discussion, because if you're in a clarinet player in a klezmer band, you are appealing to tradition. You're playing historically Jewish wedding music, right? So, and there are bands like the Klezmer All-Stars that took it to a new level, but broke out. But still, the foundation is very much set. But a guitar, fundamentally, you know, for lack of a better term, rock stuff, you know, there's not a lot of rules. And I think some people mind the past, and that's okay. They get the good nuggets. I think some people mind the past and say, oh, that hasn't been ripped off yet, or hasn't been ripped off enough. I'll take it. I'll do it.
Yeah, sure.
You know, and so there's a combination of things. You know, it's there. You wade through the stew of the internet.
Yeah.
Right. There's, you know, 10,000 bands every minute that I can listen to, and I'll listen to a bunch, and I'll, you know, you go, oh man, what are they, you know, what were they thinking? That's just, it's rehash. But conversely, for me, it's a personal thing. I stumble upon stuff that I go, wow, I've never heard anything before. This is great. These are, you know, bands taking things to new levels, even if sometimes it's just for 1 or 2 songs.
Right.
You know, as a side note, I think we've talked about this at some point.
Yeah.
We curate, you know, we need a top 10 list of the month for us, you know, and it could be back, you know, it's probably time for me to go back to the first 2 Death albums.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like just have a deep dive and go, okay, front to back, top to bottom, I'm going in.
Yeah.
To remember what I felt, see if I feel the same things I felt, you know. But
that's, I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but you know, for those who don't know, we should, well, anyway, you've owned the studio for how long now? And you've recorded a lot of types of bands, so your ears are trained a whole different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think about music differently. I'm not saying that it's good or bad. In some ways, it's probably certainly lost my purity some time ago. But yeah, I've been recording for, you know, almost 35 years, and have had more or less a professional studio for the last 25 or so. So yes, I get to work with a lot of different types of music. And while I've worked with some decent sized acts from around the globe, most artists I've worked with are local bands touring through Colorado, or local bands from Colorado, in a lot of different genres. And I actually like that a lot, because I get to interact with people that are somewhere in the beginning to middle of their career. And so you see there's a lot of change, a lot of openness, sometimes fear, confusion, you know, I mean, the whole gamut. But, you know, I've been privy to a lot of people's evolutions and genesis, you know, within their scene and their style, you know, and again, all over the map with styles for the most part. But, you know, yeah, it gives me a different outlook, you know, generally good, but I try not to be too cynic, but too much of a cynic rather. But yeah, it's, you know, without going down a whole different diatribe there, that's been wonderful. And, you know,
well, it's
story.
Well, yeah, talking about those, because you got the younger folks coming in. I wonder, I mean, Chuck Schuldiner sounds like he's that, you know, kind of self-possessed. Some things just coalesced in him, you know, same way as a Cobain in the middle of all these things, or Eddie Van Halen, or David Lee Roth, who wanted to be famous. And I just, you know, remember, you know, again, whether it's internet or not, I mean, talking about listening to all these bands, that's what we would do. You know, we didn't have, I mean, we had video games. We could have done that. We could have had, you know, comic books. I mean, it wasn't as commodified and, you know, mainstreamed as it is now. There's the two good buzzwords, but I just wonder, I mean, were you and Chuck kind of listening to music at that time, or was that not even riding bikes around and just knocking around as kids? I mean, it wasn't even, because you started around 16, 13, 16 playing.
Yes, I started about age 16.
Yeah, okay, same for me.
So, and it's funny, I don't want to get this wrong, but I believe Chuck lent me a bootleg tape of Metallica from like early days, like one of their early shows at some club, and it sounded awful sonically, but we were all like, holy crap, like, dude, what is this? Where is this coming from? So, we had Touchstone, stuff like that. We used to sit in the woods when we were all a little older, driving age, it'd be a bonfire in the middle of nowhere, and we'd sit around, arguing about who gets to pick the next song, and there'd be back and forth about who was the best guitar player. Everybody had a strong feeling about that, which was ultimately good. Opinions were being formed, but it was, unfortunately, we didn't, at just about the time my band was doing its thing and getting somewhere, he was clearly getting somewhere. They were doing great. And again, they had spread their wings and moved on. So I didn't even have the luxury of sharing the stage with him, as I did many of other bands in Orlando and around the state. We'd see each other once a month. We'd talk, we'd share gear, we'd discuss ideas and concepts. I would have loved to have been able to do that with Chuck later on, because I feel like he grew up faster than I did. Definitely. He matured much quicker than I did. And then when I finally felt like, oh, okay, I'm understanding a lot of this, not technically, but just like emotionally, interpersonally, like, how to be open to certain aspects of music. And then I'd love to be able to spend more time with him to talk about that stuff. Because I think early on that was there, but, not enough. And again, we were still just kids knocking around, just stealing milk crates was, pretty high up on our itinerary.
Your weight in crates. Oh,
yep.
Well, I just, I wonder if that's, I mean, we had distractions. Obviously, we know how many distractions we have these days. I just wonder if it's, those kids who are kind of the loner kid or whatever, just not even loner, but just kind of, you've got your own kind of thing going on. I mean, I'm an only child, you are not. So I mean, it's a different kind of thing where you're there, but you're not fully present maybe. And there's just things going on in your head, maybe percolating.
Yeah. Well, and I think in a good way, in his case, it's like tunnel vision, you get something on the radar and you realize you really want that. So you work towards it. There's one thing that comes to mind that is very important that I hope a lot of bands today take to heart, which was back then, any recording you were going to do was all like punching in and out was a luxury, right? So you might punch in for a solo, double track stuff, maybe not, but by and large, it was going to tape. And so you had to get it really tight from point A to point B. You had to know it inside and out. And all of us, because we were going into that sort of recording environment when we did, could play the songs front to back as well as we could. I mean, we knew every note inside and out. And you really got to a point, and often with vocals, cutting it live, we did that all the time in the first recordings my band did, because that's all we could afford. To go into an 8-track studio, maybe a 16-track studio, and just lay it all down front to back with isolation. And then if I was lucky, and usually I had the luxury, I'd be able to overdub a guitar solo or maybe double track something. But I thought a couple times about like the first recordings they did for that first album on Combat. And I'm sure that was the case. They had to get in there and knock it out, so you had to know your stuff. So that's a lot of hustle and legwork ahead of the thing, up front, the amount of really knowing what you want, and you start cutting away the layers of bullshit, when you're in the writing phase. And then when you've got it where you want it, that's it. It's written in stone, and you're going to take it to the tape that way. And that's something that, as a studio owner these days, I don't always see. Now, there's a lot of studio writing opportunity now that there wasn't back then, at least for people at that, that level of what you could afford. Now people can come in, and I've worked on projects that are months long, and artists come in and they're figuring it out in the studio. And because it's often digital, we can manipulate things, try different ideas on the fly.
Yeah.
You're not waiting for the tape to rewind, which for me is a pleasant sensation to wait for the tape to rewind. I still remember that.
Yeah.
But a lot of bands back then, they had to. And I think Death was certainly absolutely on the same page. You had to have it down. You had to know what you're going to do and get it front to back and go into that studio to where, what, 2-3 takes maybe, and the song is good. It's in the can.
Yeah.
So I think that psychologically plays into it all, in muscle memory, all that.
Yeah.
So, and that takes a focused set of people to do that.
And particularly in that genre too. I mean, you're pushing, I mean, all music is kind of competitive. I mean, let's face it. I mean, Mersey beat bands are stealing from each other or watching, or they gaining ground. Can we steal that person? I mean, what he was doing was, I mean, if you're talking 84 to 87, you've had Black Flag, you've had, all the SST bands, you had some, that Japanese band GISM, you've had, I mean, really underground, the early thrash stuff, and, all those metal bands kind of in that space, maybe between New Wave of British and California thrash, New York thrash, whatever. And it's not it's a demanding, talk about having to get it right the first time. I mean, and talk about going back and listening to those Death records. I mean, it's like way out there, as much as Eddie Van Halen was, in my view. I mean, when you listen to it, it's like, I mean, you've got the big four, and then this is coming out, and maybe, the nascent kind of dark death, black, whatever, grindcore over there in Europe, in Germany, Norway, whatever. I'm not versed in it, obviously, but, it's just, and it's interesting. I wonder if well, you were going to say something there, so I'm sorry.
I agree with you. And I think that it was almost a subculture response to some of the big bands of the day. Even big bands like Van Halen is undoubtedly a fantastic band. Eddie Van Halen, pioneer beyond word. But I remember conversations with my peers at that time where, I mean, I was a huge Eddie Van Halen fan, but I think a lot of guys, not a lot, some were certainly going out of the way to find other great players or other players. And I remember that some of my friends really being into rhythm playing. And I mean that in the best way. And it was easy to get so excited about Eddie Van Halen's solos. And in fact, he's notably a fantastic rhythm player. I mean, his writing and his wrist, that's all of it is phenomenal. But I knew guys that were really latching on the power of rhythm. And I think about, a lot of like dual guitar bands, like, that were coming out of Europe, that became this foundation, that the rhythm guitar player gave something special, this next layer. And I think that was like a response to great soloing, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but they're like, okay, great, Eddie's great, but there's other things going on in the music. And I think that was a part of it. I think that whole, what turned into the death metal scene to a degree was an anti-hero sort of response, I think most of those guys and girls that I knew would have said, yeah, Eddie's a great player, but they were all black jeans and black t-shirts. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It was just like, we're not going to be, just because it's a guitar, we're not going to be identified easily. You're not going to with them. And I mean, and I would love to be lumped in with Eddie Van Halen, but but that never happened. But I get where they were coming from. It was counterculture to a subtle counterculture. And so you start swirling into smaller and smaller circles, but then you really get focused. The good artists, they say, okay, I really have found my space. Now I'm going to push it as far as I can. And again, I mean, Chuck did that because there was such an evolution of his music over the years of the multiple projects. And getting back to, players. He, as I understand and recall, I mean, they went through a lot. You know, there was a lot of different players in and out of the band for tours, recording, breakups, and whatnot. And that, you know, I never knew him well enough to know that could be a function of his frustration or his dedication, and how that frustrated people around him. You know, some combination therein. But yeah, it's just, he's a prime example at the end of it all for me. He was a prime example of somebody finding a vision and really sticking with it, not being afraid to evolve it, and sticking to his guns, and subsequently creating a whole genre. I mean, and I mean that in the most loving way. Like, just how phenomenal is that? Yeah. So,
well,
yeah.
and kind of finding your community beyond where you are, because it sure wasn't. I mean, it was kind of there. I mean, you were there, you know, in that group. We were somewhere else, you know. There was different groups, and you kind of met up at like Wax Tree Records or something on Aloma. Was it Aloma 436 in Aloma, something like that? You'd meet there. If that was even there, then I forget. I mean, but it seemed like more of an indie scene, and the metal stuff kind of got, interestingly enough, pushed away there. Was that? I mean,
I think for them to go further, to support themselves, to grow their niche, like, they had to go to Europe. You know, Europe was hungry for that stuff.
No,
easy. You know, you hear horror stories all the time about a lot of bands, heavy bands, going there because that seemed like those were where all the fans were. The fans were there, you know, but the promoters and the clubs were not really from, you know, often enough stories, not the best to work with. So, but yeah, it just, like any scene, things start subdividing, you know. And I think when we were all younger, we were all just playing, and then people started finding their own. You know, you go to school with a bunch of people when you're in high school. You know, if you get along with folks, you know everybody, so to speak.
right.
But then, you know, 10 years later, you look, you meet up and you say, "Oh, we're not the same anymore." Right. You know, we've all gone down our own paths. And so I think that's inevitable with any scene. Right. And I think that was inevitable then. And again, I think that the early heavy stuff that they were doing was such a niche thing when it started. Of course, now it's huge, right? Yeah. But which is great. But I think that they had to, you know, they had to go on. They had to keep moving, and you become insular at a certain level until you find your other, you know, parts of your tribe out there, right. You know, in the
right. Now it's interesting because, again, I mean, you had like Lakeland Civic Center, you had big bands coming through, not like at the Orlando. Well, you had the Who played. They played at Orlando, right, in '82. Yeah, they did. So that was like, but like say '87-ish, you didn't really hear anyone kind of touting, "Hey, this band is from here." I remember I thought, didn't the Smashing Pumpkins go to Mark Ignaffo in Daytona to do some demos with him, or no?
No, so Mark had moved to Daytona. His studio originally in Chicago.
Okay.
So the Pumpkins did their first, it was demos that turned into an EP, as I recall. And it was all the tape. But yeah, and then he just coincidentally wanted to leave the big city, the windy city, and ended up in sunny, you know, Daytona Beach. Right. And I just stumbled on him, and he had the week open that we wanted, you know, and we ended up making a couple records there with him. Nice. But yeah. And again, it's another sign of things fracturing and things change. You know, people move. It's the other part of the industry that also transitions. Studios open and close, clubs open and close. I mean, there was really cool stuff going on in downtown Orlando. You talk about, you know, Damage. Those guys were, I mean, they were like a cornerstone of all things irregular about music in Orlando. But they were routinely booking enormous acts, and in great and regional local acts. And, you know,
DJ Allen.
Yeah, famously. Well, that's what put him out of business. We'll stay together.
Yeah.
I was there for that too. I wasn't there for the show. I was there for the chaos before the show. But they, but they ultimately closed. Areas gentrified. It's like all the subsets of things that happen that, we all had a cheap warehouse we could rent. And some bands, 2 or 3 bands would share a warehouse. Great, save the money. But as those things went away, that affected, what bands did and how bands thought about doing things and where they did it. And there's all these trickle downline effects that come into play. So, but I think what Chuck and Death were doing with like really heavy metal in the form they had it in was still pretty unique. And so I think once they were able to get out there was going to be love it or hate it for music lovers, even people in the metal genre, there were naysayers, but the people that did like it were lifelong fans. I mean, it's that simple. I mean, when you're really true and honest to something you feel good about doing and you keep doing it and you do it well, other people, even if it's a small slice of humanity, those people, once they find it, if it resonates with them, they're in, they're lifers. So.
Well, it's like with Rush, right? I mean, it's like when the Rush documentary and Gene Simmons says, what does Rush sound like? It's Rush. There still is nothing, tons of prog bands and tons of trios, but nothing like that. Iggy Pop were there, the last, that TKO, what is it, the bootleg? Of course, I can't remember it now, but that last show, they're like throwing the beer bottles at him. I mean, it's not even gentle. I mean, it's a brutal war between the fans. And now, of course, he's, they're rabid for him. I mean, one of the scariest things I ever saw. I saw him at Roseland when they came out when the brothers Ashton were still alive. And he said, "Should I come up on stage?" Like, whoa. It's like Roseland. It's like, holy, this guy next to me was like rabid, wide-eyed all the time. It's like, so yeah, I'm Guar fan, same thing. It's just like what? They came through, and that was like, so man, so that's great. Yeah.
There's a lot to be said for sticking to your guns, being yourself, and once you light a torch, you feel good about it, carry it. That speaks volumes. When you run into those people, when you meet those people, I was fortunate enough to just be a bike buddy, when we were younger, but it was good. I mean, I was glad, that I was in the periphery somewhere, in my own way, doing my own thing, but there was enough of that community to say, hey, what's going on? What's Death doing? Or get the word like, oh, that's awesome. They did this or that. So awesome. Yeah, serendipity.
Yeah. Gone too young, Chuck Schuldiner, but happy birthday this month.
Yeah, absolutely. Rest in peace, Chuck.
Yep. All right. Well, till next time, folks, be well, listen to cool stuff.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to seeing you more.
Yeah.